So good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Rich Quinlan. I am the director of the St. Elizabeth Center for Holocaust and Genocide Education, and I'd like to welcome you to our beautiful campus tonight for what is going to be a remarkable evening of remembrance, honor, and recognition of the legacy of the Armenian genocide. We have already been graced tonight with some incredibly beautiful and poignant music, and our speakers this evening are undoubtedly going to both engage and entertain us. We know all too well that right now we live in an age in which disinformation, conspiracy theories, lies, and historical distortion has become almost ubiquitous. So the fact that all of us have gathered here this evening on what is Armenian Martyrs' Day is more than just an event to remember and recognize the past. It's also a commitment to making sure that history is taught properly, taught accurately, to ensure that future generations do more than simply utter never again, or simply wonder what happened, and make sure that they have a full and robust knowledge of their own history so that they can pass along those lessons to their children. And so the horrors of the past are not repeated. It is truly an honor for me to be here this evening with all of you. And to officially begin tonight's program, I would like to welcome the esteemed president of St. Elizabeth University, Dr. Gary Crosby. Dr. Crosby is a leading advocate of the work of our Holocaust and Genocide Center, and I'd like to please welcome him to the stage now. Dr. Crosby.
Thank you, Rich. Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Board of Trustees, our students, faculty, staff, and alumni, it is my honor to welcome you to St. Elizabeth University's Armenian Genocide Remembrance Program. This is a solemn gathering to remember the 1.5 million Armenians who perished during one of the earliest atrocities of the 20th century. This evening, we pause to not only remember the lives lost, but also to reaffirm our shared commitment to truth, to justice, and to the enduring importance of historical memory. At a university founded on the values of compassion, dignity, and human rights, we believe that remembrance is a moral imperative, and silence is never an option. I thank you all for joining us this evening and for experiencing this moment of reflection, and I invite you to stand with us this evening and in the future as we honor the past and strive for a future where such tragedies are never repeated. So again, thank you so very much for being here with us, and I'm so very delighted to welcome you as the president of this fine institution of higher learning. Enjoy the evening.
Thank you, Dr. Crosby. I would like to please invite Father Joe Farias to the stage. Father Farias is the chaplain of St. Elizabeth University, and he is also a special advisor to the president. He is now going to grace us with our opening prayer. Father Joe.
Before we pray, I just wanted to point out that one of the last things that Pope Francis did was to name a Catholic bishop a saint because he was a martyr in the genocide. An Armenian Catholic bishop has just been named a saint. It's appropriate to remember that today. So let us pray. O God of the living and embracer of those who have died, hearts break with devastation, and it is your heart that bleeds over human destruction, any shedding of blood. Recollection may be dimmed, but you never forget. May our memory never be sealed, lest our forgetfulness move us to complacence of such violence, and the stories of the martyrs be unheard. Along with those whose lives were destroyed, we also remember those who defiled orders, who rebelled against power. We mark a bit more than a century of devastation since Armenia. Holocaust, Rwanda, Bosnia, Cambodia, Darfur, Kurds in Iraq, Burma, and more, east, north, south, and west. We lament the continuation of cruel hatred for others because of race, religion, physical, and gender differences. For hate is never victory. Peace only reigns when it is global. May that peace begin in our hearts and extend from our hands to the ends of the earth. We ask you this, our God who are loving. Amen.
Thank you, Father Joe. As so many of you here tonight know, Roy Stepanian is an integral component of our center's advisory board and a person that without whom this event truly could not occur. Roy regrets that he's not able to join us here this evening, but he requested that this powerful memorial to the survivors of the Armenian genocide be presented for the audience tonight. It is particularly fitting to host all of you this evening and to offer you this brief film, which is called The Legacy of Our Martyrs.
In the early 1980s, the St. Mary Armenian Church of Livingston, New Jersey, documented the moving stories and experiences of its parishioners who lived through the atrocities perpetrated by the Ottoman Turkish government during the Armenian Genocide of 1915. It is important to note that to this day, the Turkish government still denies these horrific events ever took place. The following are some of their stories.
This program that many of us are going to see today is important because we'll be talking to people who lived through it, who were there. Their eyewitness picture of you, of how life really was 70 years ago or so. And also part of the difficult period of our history during the beginning of the 20th century. I'm very thankful that our adults of our community could make it here today with us. And I pray that the experience that we're all going to witness here today will sort of make us fully understand, or more so understand, our heritage and our way of life.
Good afternoon. Today we're gathered together with a number of the elderlies from our church to discuss their migration to this country, the difficulties they went through, the travels they did, and their impressions of the new country. We're not going to dwell too much on the difficulties and the atrocities that had happened, but we're sure that that subject will come up. It is being put together as a documentary, which we feel is going to be very good for our ancestors as well as our current population. As an introduction, I'm going to go through the members that have joined us here. I want to welcome them. We have Mr. Jack Bozian, Agop Bozian. We have Mrs. Navad Badishkhanian, Mrs. Shushan Barmakian, Mrs. Haganush Tukmanian, and Mr. Diran Tukmanian. And the questions are going to be basically very general type questions. One thing that we would like to know, when you were born a few years ago, how many members were in your family?
We were three sisters, my father, my grandfather and mother, and two uncles. And after a couple of years, when the war started, after a year passed, I imagine it was, the house that we lived in, it was a very big house with 3 families. There was about 20 people in the house, but we were 8, all of us.
Were they all related? Were the 3 families related?
No, they weren't related. They're each family.
Mm-hmm.
One family was her grandfather's family, grandmother's family. And then another family, they were 4, and we were about 8 of us. So...
they were all Armenians?
Oh, yes. It was a big house, and we all lived together.
Was the town...
Not in one room. Everybody had their own apartment.
Sure. Just, was the town totally an Armenian town, or was it a mixed town?
No, mixed.
It was mixed?
It was a mixed town with Turks.
Turks?
Oh, yes.
Not Kurds?
So, we had few Kurds.
You had a few Kurds also?
There were few Kurds.
Go ahead, a little more about the family.
They used to come from around the next towns. They used to come selling things.
May I ask the name of the town?
Our town, Dikranagir.
Dikranagir, okay.
The Turks didn't like to call Dikranagir because that was in Armenian. So they called Diyarbakir.
Diyarbakir, of course.
Yeah, it's very hard to explain everything. 4 years went by to explain 4 years agony in 4 or 5 minutes.
So we don't want to get into the agony part. We don't want to make it difficult.
By the time came for us, they used to put gendarmes in the houses. So that meant that this family, the whole house has to go town by town. So my sister older than me, they saw the Turks saw, and they said, we want this girl to be taken out. They wanted her to be released from there because the Turk wanted to have her.
Well, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions to make it a little more comfortable. Let me ask you about your school, Mrs. Badishvanian.
Wait a minute.
Okay.
When my sister went in that house, shall I say you did too? My sister and her, there were two pairs. So both of them, they took in that cross street house. That cross street house, the man was a photographer. This man used to take the pictures where they used to take it out and kill them. And they used to take him out and photograph those pictures, and they used to send to Constantinople, telling that Armenians are doing this. So this man knew that he was going to be chopped off too. When my sister and my sister-in-law, they go there, my sister starts crying, I want my mother. So a word came in the house that my mother told me, everybody's going to go out, you hold my hands. We're going to go to Cross Street House. So the time came in the morning. We went. My mother took me. We went to that house, and we stayed there for a couple nights. Then we couldn't stay anymore in that house. The photographer had a big office. He took us over there, my mother and I. We used to stay there, and whenever he had time, he used to bring us food. Otherwise, we used to stay there. So one day, my mother said, Krikor hasn't been around a long time. We don't have no food. We can't stay here. And they're going to come and take us away sooner or later. When I went to that house, to Krikor's house, the photographer's, the mother said, the mother and sisters stay he had. He hasn't been around for a couple of days. We don't know where he is. So after I left the house, I went back. People go there, the Turks go there and say, did that little girl left here? And we're going to... Anyway, I told my mother, so stay here.
Relax.
I don't know. After that, I don't know what happened. We were on the streets here and there. People helped us to stay until my sister was able to get us where he was.
Where did you go from there? From your town, where did you go?
No town. It was in
From
the same
Dikranaget,
town
where
as
did you,
his.
okay.
From Dikranaget, the time came that we were going to go out. Now my stories are long too.
It's all right.
My youngest brother was in America. My oldest brother was in Turkish army. And then he went to English army. And he wanted to know who's safe from his family. Finally, somebody came and told my mother that they're looking for your people. If it's possible to let him know if you're alive, how many are you alive in your family. So we wrote to them that we are 3 of us left, my sister and I alone. And then my brother in America heard it. So from then on, words came, and we left the country in 1990. So
Okay, very good.
there are plenty of things in between.
There are so many stories.
Yes.
I'm going to move to Sediran Turkmania.
And then my brother went on.
This is the time my mother
So from then on,
told me with a bloody heart and tears in her eyes
1990.
what happened to my father.
Very good.
There are plenty of things in
There are so many stories.
They called him on a false pretense that the city Kaimakam, they call it, the mayor, wants to discuss with him some certain things, and they took him from home, and they took him to a certain place where there were many other notable Armenians. They were all there, they were all heads cut off, and their bloody shards were delivered to their family. And my mother told me my classmates, well, they were 13, 14, 10, 11 years old boys, tied up behind the horse and driven until they died. And then other children were put in a certain room and the fire with him so that they can die in the fire. All these stories my mother told me. I couldn't help myself, naturally. I cried, and I tried to keep my mother a little more comfortable. I said, okay, mother, forget it. You're here, everything is different. So that's the way it happened, and that's where it stopped. And God bless her soul, my mother died, my three sisters died. Now we have only one brother and one sister left from the family. And as far as the family, I'll keep my mother a little more comfortable. I said, okay, mother, forget it. You're here, everything is different. So that's the way it happened, and that's
Quinlan, and trying to decide what the program is going to have and what is my role. And I said, can I have 5 minutes? I'd like to introduce you and the speaker and a few remarks. He says, Vartan, 5 minutes? You're such a great personality. You can have as much time as you want. So I'm going to stick to my 5 minutes. First, thanking you all for being here tonight. And of course, a huge thank you to St. Elizabeth University for opening its doors for us to congregate and to communicate. Thank you, Dr. Richard Quinlan, Director of the Holocaust Genocide Education Center, for his untiring efforts to help direct people to the truth by promoting frank dialogue among communities, cultures, and religions. Throughout the years, some 20 similar programs take place in this institution, and this is a very impressive number. As Richard said on the radio interview Sunday, he said, we all want the same thing. We want to make people know and remember what happened in our history. This program of remembrance helps us immerse in Armenian culture, whether it was through food, the music we heard, and in this portion, the lecture. Actually, it is a celebration of Armenian life as well as educational. This program has been held in this university for over 10 years, and it is made possible through the generosity of the Dadurian Foundation and the leadership and dedication of a good friend, Mr. Roy Stepanian. The desperations Armenian faced 110 years ago was quickly replaced by determination, immigrant determination to survive and to thrive, to rise and organize, to recreate their culture after the cultural genocide of 1915. Wherever Armenians went, they built churches and then schools to safeguard their Christian heritage and Armenian identity. In the words of an Armenian writer, poet, editor, David Kerdian, who was born on December 17, 1931, in Racine, Wisconsin, He wrote and said, the closest we came to being in the old country was attending church on Sundays and Armenian classes on Fridays. Allow me to inject remarks, quotes from David Kerdyan. He is one of the very few American Armenian intellectuals who has captured the experiences of the first generation of Armenians in America. He was one man whose writings have helped us understand all the cultural losses we Armenians experienced. A man who guides us on the path of recovery. The first generation of Armenians came to this country not knowing a single word in English. It is ironic that today the present generation knows very little or no Armenian. A couple weeks ago, I was in Montreal, in the Laval suburb of Montreal, where Armenians had purchased an abandoned school. Armenians purchased an abandoned school and converted it into a church, into a community center, into classrooms, meeting halls. Walking down one of the corridors, I saw a room filled with some 40 men, sitting 4 at the table, playing cards, backgammon, drinking coffee, and smoking. Just imagine 40 people in one room that holds maybe 10 or 12. David Kerdyan wrote about a similar experience about coffee houses some 100 years ago in Racine, Wisconsin. Very far away, Racine, Wisconsin, Armenians. And he wrote, my father always carried a different look and a different smell into the house. As kids, playing in the streets, we would stop, walk quietly by, and peer in through the cracked doors at the hunched backgammon players, their Turkish coffee cups at their elbows. And he writes, only years later I came to understand that in these coffee houses were contained the suffering and the shattered hopes of my orphan people. In 2025, the people with shattered hopes in Montreal are refugees from the Middle East, from Armenia and Karabakh. And I don't have to go into details of the history of these people. Here are some other quotes from Kerdyan, which will help us understand the cultural clash Armenians had gone through in this country. And he writes, the embarrassment I felt having an immigrant father who could barely speak English and whose ex I had to verify each Friday at the local Farmers and Merchants Bank. In a letter to his father, he wrote, Dad, it startled me that you had no interest in things athletic or anything American. You were an Armenian in America, whereas I was an American inside an Armenia I never saw, nor did I long for. And then he continues writing, Dad, when you walked to the post office to mail a letter home with your postal money order, all you thought about on your walk was your birthplace, Adana, and Armenia, which you never saw. Dad, your devotion to family and friends that I pitied then hurt by the humiliation I felt it caused you, I honor now as a quality that revealed your strength of character, for you were able to love unconditionally, which I know now to be one of the rarest attributes and most important qualities any man may possess. And finally, David Carradine writes, what can one man know of another's grief, especially when one is still a boy and the other had been boyhood robbed? Ladies and gentlemen, a Harvard professor once bragged, most branches of learning are taught at Harvard. An Armenian whispered, yes, all the branches, but none of the roots. Tonight, we have a very unique opportunity to take a good look at the roots of Armenian culture with our keynote speaker, Dr. Jesse Arlen. He will talk about creating culture after cultural genocide 110 years later. Any genocide is usually followed by historicide or cultural genocide. Dr. Arlen is a good friend, a scholar, author, translator, and the director of the Krikor and Clara Zohrab Information Center at the Eastern Diocese of the Armenian Church of America in New York City. Thank you very much for your patience and attention. Please help me welcome Dr. Jesse Arlen to the stage. It's all yours.
Well, I would like to express my thanks to St. Elizabeth University and the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Education for hosting tonight's program, and specifically to Dr. Richard Quinlan for inviting me to speak tonight, and for everyone for being here. We're here tonight on the occasion of the 110th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide. We'll speak later about what happened on exactly this night, 110 years ago in Constantinople, Istanbul. Nevertheless, by almost any metric, the Armenian Genocide neither began and certainly did not end 110 years ago. Indeed, the Armenian Genocide continues today in many ways. In the ongoing destruction of churches, Armenian churches in Turkey throughout the 20th and into the 21st century. For example, Nadeg Monastery on the screen here was standing in 1915 and throughout the early 20th century, but was destroyed in the 1950s with a mosque raised in its place. This is the site of our greatest saint and writer, Saint Gregory of Nadeg, who Pope Francis had declared a doctor of the Universal Church in 2015. We see it in the uprooting and displacement of the Armenian community of Nagorno-Karabakh, Artsakh, and Azerbaijan, the intentional destruction of churches and other monuments there, even entire villages. We see it in the endangered Republic of Armenia, with Azerbaijani-Turkish encroachment on its eastern borders and peace proposals that demand the elimination of genocide recognition or reparation as a matter of governmental policy. We could also go not forward, but backward in time, from before 110 years ago, to see earlier iterations of massacres, deportations, forced relocation, and cultural destruction that eventually reached its apex in the genocide of 1915. A branch of my own family came to America after waves of massacres that occurred at the end of the 19th century under Sultan Abdul Hamid II, the 34th and final sultan of the Ottoman Empire. My father's maternal grandfather, Vartan Momjian, was born in Antep in 1875. In the 1890s, when he was a teenager, Turkish soldiers arrived at his family home when he happened to be out. And when he noticed the unusual situation upon arriving home, he snuck into the house by a back window and hid himself in a closet. From his hiding place, he witnessed the slaughter of everyone in his multi-generational family home, including his older sister and her 8 young children. Completely alone and bereft of all family members, he managed to make his way to America. Eventually, he met my great-grandmother, Martha Movsesian, born in Ichme, a small village near Harput, in 1881, who likewise had immigrated to America along with her 2 brothers after massacres during this time. Both these places would be emptied of their remaining Armenian populations in the genocide that took place under the cover of population relocation during World War I. This process repeated itself across all the Armenian populated villages, towns, and cities of Turkey in 1915, with the majority of the Armenian population being murdered, between 1 to 2 million souls. However, this genocide was not just about the murder of innocent men, women, and children, but also about cultural destruction. And it is this latter theme that I would like to focus on tonight, while also considering the possibility, or I would say the necessity, of cultural renewal, that is, of creating culture after genocide. This map, which I apologize for how blurry it is, shows the locations of the over 3,000 Armenian churches and monasteries in the Ottoman Empire on the eve of World War I. Today, just a handful of these churches are even still standing. Most have been either converted to mosques or barns for animals, or razed to the ground and utterly destroyed. This is cultural annihilation on a mass scale. All the more so because in the Armenian world, churches and monasteries were not just religious houses of worship, but were the centers of Armenian cultural production from the time when the alphabet was invented in the 5th century during the extended process of the Christian evangelization of Armenia up through the 19th century. During these long ages, all schools were located at monasteries, and all those who learned to read and write did so at monastic schools. The writers and most readers of the Armenian literary tradition were priests or monks at these monastic centers. Books were produced in their scriptoria and preserved in monastic libraries. During the genocide, thousands of manuscripts were destroyed, some containing unpublished and unknown texts, now lost forever. Monasteries were also the centers of the visual arts in the form of manuscript illumination, as well as music and chanting. The vast majority of artistic production and the various art forms, from music and chant to khachkars, crossstones, to liturgical vestments, were products of Armenian Christian and primarily monastic culture. This was all on grand display in the acclaimed 2019 exhibit Armenia at the Metropolitan Museum in New York, which I'm sure many of you went to, which celebrated the centuries of artistic and literary production of the primarily Armenian Christian tradition. All of this was targeted for annihilation in the genocide, along with the Armenian people. While massacre, exile, displacement, looting, and cultural destruction were all taken to an extreme never before experienced in 1915, none of these events in themselves were a new reality for Armenians in their traditional homeland. On the contrary, they had been part and parcel of Armenian lived experience for over a millennium. Indeed, we could easily add another 0 to the title of our talk and speak about cultural destruction 1,010 years ago, or in nearly any century of the last millennium. In the 11th century, Turkic tribes began not just invading en masse to the Armenian plateau and highlands and throughout the Anatolian peninsula, but they slaughtered the local population, they settled in their lands, and they established dynasties there. At this time, Armenians experienced mass dislocation and exile after several autonomous Armenian kingdoms, the Bagratuni, Artsuni, were absorbed first by the Byzantine Empire and then conquered from the Byzantines by the Seljuk Turks. Amidst this upheaval and catastrophe, thousands were exiled from their traditional homeland and fled elsewhere. For example, northwest to the Black Sea or southwest to the area of Kilikia, Cilicia, around the Taurus mountain range and the northeastern Mediterranean seacoast. In this latter area, in Cilicia, Armenians lived not as depressed, defeated exiles, but rather managed to create anew, rebuilding the cultural institutions of their homeland on foreign soil. Eventually, during the period of the Crusades, through alliance and intermarriage with Frankish crusaders, they were able to establish a kingdom that lasted for nearly 2 centuries. During this time, the region of Cilicia, which was not the native homeland of Armenia, became the cultural and religious center of the Armenian people. In a stunning reversal of fortune, Armenians achieved a height of cultural production in literature, the visual arts, architecture, and other areas in Cilicia almost unrivaled by any other period of Armenian history. This was an intentional project and did not just happen of its own accord. Rather, it took strategic planning and prioritizing and was a conscious operation in the minds of those in charge. One of the central figures in this period was Saint Nerses Shnorhali, whose Pahlavuni family accounted for 7 successive Catholicoi, the head of the Armenian Church, over a period of nearly 150 years, from 1066 to 1203. Nerses, who himself was Catholicos from 1166 to 1173, was one of the greatest authors in the pre-modern Armenian literary tradition. His first literary work is a poetic epic that tells the history of Armenia, from the beginning to his own day, highlighting the role of his own family, the Pahlavuni, who claimed descent from the Arsacid Arshakuni kings of Armenia, who ruled from the 1st to 5th century AD, as well as the dynasty of early Catholicoi, from St. Gregory the Illuminator to Sahak the Great, 4th and 5th century, during what is known as the Golden Age of Armenian culture. Shnorhali's family, the Pahlavuni, thus represented connection with the lost past and provided stability and continuity after a period of dislocation, disruption, and exile that bore some similarities to the genocide of 1915, though on a smaller scale. In this work of his, he narrates the destruction and ravagement brought about by the invading Turkic tribes. However, the work is primarily hopeful and optimistic in nature, as he celebrates the reestablishment, renewal, and reconstruction of Armenian civilization and cultural religious institutions in Cilicia, which his own ancestors and he himself played the major part in. This work, written in classical Armenian, has not been translated to English before, but I would like us to look at a few excerpts that I translated for us tonight. You can see the title of it on the screen. Here's the part that talks about the coming of the Turks. He says, "And after the Arabs, another nation arose, leaving their uninhabitable place, the collective nation named Turks. Their number overwhelmed the natural numbers. Bloodthirsty like wild beasts, they spread throughout the realm, dominating everything on this side of the sea. By such nations have we been tormented. We have left the land of our birth, exiled from our fatherland, become sojourners in a strange land, so long that we have forgotten our own. Foreigners devoured our realm before our very eyes." And then he talks about the destruction of the Armenian kingdoms and the abandonment, the Catholicoses who had to abandon their place of location. He says, "The throne of our ancestor," Gregory's throne, "where light had dawned, stands shrouded in mist, its incumbents gone far off, roaming about in far lands. The house, the royal house, that gloried in a crown, has become a slave of the unworthy. Those who ruled many realms, the former Armenian kings, now beg for bread from the hungry. Yet those called Pahlavuni, his family, We're descended of that race, son following father, coming all the way to us. Beginning from our ancestral father, illumined by the Parthian, down to the brave Vasak, he who was martyred with his own blood, from whom Gregory was born a son, given the honorific Magistros. And this is Gregory Magistros, 11th century, who was the progenitor of all the Paphlavouni Catholikoi, and who Snorali presents in a way that you can see he's presenting as recreating and renewing Armenian culture. He says, Grigor Magistros wrote verse after the manner of Homer, it's Nersa Snorali's grandfather, and was eloquent like Plato, deeply learned in Greek, just like the 5th century translators. He turned the Bible into verse, educating himself therein day after day. He built elegant churches, building up the land of Armenia, organized monasteries, sponsored monks, received the productive, gathered a flock of Vartabeds, in essence, reestablishing the cultural institutions that would sustain and create Armenian culture in a new place. And then he talks about Krikor Vagayaser, the first of the Paphlavouni Catholikoi, who with him could celebrate the return of the dynasty of Saint Gregory the Illuminator. And look at the language he uses to describe it. When they're choosing the new Catholicos, it pleased the will of all to seek and bring out Krikor, formerly called Zohrab. Anointed with the anointing of the Spirit, he was seated anew on the throne of his ancestor. A new Aaron, adorned with mitre, a Samuel dedicated to the Lord, placed as a foundation stone for the church. He illuminated the churches, was revealed to us as a second Mesrope, translating many writings from Greek and Syriac. You know, the description of the invasions, the destruction, the exile reads almost like it could have been written in the 19th or 20th century. But the renewal, the cultural creation afterwards is something maybe we don't have such a parallel of today. In connection with the theme of my talk, let's remember why it is, though, that as a people we've chosen to commemorate the genocide on this date of April 24th. What was it that happened then? The evening of April 24th, 1915, 110 years ago today, is the night when over 200 of the most important Armenian community and cultural leaders were arrested in Istanbul and sent into the Turkish interior, most to their deaths. Not just political leaders and revolutionaries, but newspaper editors, booksellers, writers, intellectuals, and clergy. In other words, the custodians and creators of Armenian culture. This day marks the beginning of the systematic annihilation of Armenian civilization in its traditional homeland. We know some details of this night and its aftermath thanks to some firsthand survivor accounts by those who were arrested but later managed to escape. Perhaps the most prominent of these is the one you see on the screen entitled Hai Kochgotan, Armenian Golgotha, by Father Grigoris Balakian. And I have here the first edition of the work published in 1922 in Venice. And there's also a really wonderful and very readily available English translation by Otto Savak and Peter Balakian, which you can find, and if you haven't read, I would encourage everyone to read. The name and title of this work itself is significant. Armenian Golgotha. Golgotha being the place of the skull, the hill of Calvary upon which Christ was crucified. The place of crucifixion begs the question of resurrection, which Father Balakian leaves to his readers unanswered. It is up to us to answer. Can there be resurrection after genocide? While we ponder this question, let's read some moving passages from this eyewitness account that tells about this very night 110 years ago. He writes, "On the night of Saturday, April 24th, 1915, the Armenians of the capital city, exhausted from the Easter celebrations that had come to an end a few days earlier, were snoring in a calm sleep. Meanwhile, on the heights of Istanbul, near Hagia Sophia, a highly secret activity was taking place. Groups of Armenians had just been arrested in the suburbs and neighborhoods of the capital. Blood-colored military buses were now transporting them to the central prison. On this Saturday night, I, along with 8 friends from Scutari, was transported by a small steamboat. We arrived at the central prison, and here behind gigantic walls and large bolted gates, they put us in a wooden pavilion in the courtyard. We sat there, quiet and somber, on the bare wooden floor under the faint light of a flickering lantern, too stunned and confused to make sense of what was happening. From the deep silence of the night until morning, every few hours Armenians were brought to the prison. It was as if all the prominent Armenian public figures, assemblymen, representatives, revolutionaries, editors, teachers, doctors, pharmacists, dentists, merchants, bakers, and others in the capital city had made an appointment to meet in these dim prison cells. Not one of us understood why we had been arrested, and no one could assess the consequences. We, the majority of Constantinople's Armenian intellectuals and public figures, spent Red Sunday, April 25th, which followed Easter 1915, in the central prison, sad and worried and hoping for some unexpected help from somewhere. They searched us one by one, confiscating all our personal effects: money, insignificant pieces of paper, pocket knives, pencils, diaries, even our umbrellas and canes. They promised us we would get them back. When they completed their searches, they escorted us in small groups of 20 or more to the red military buses, waiting in front of the Central Police Administrative Building. At last, the mystery of the past 24 hours was partly solved. The second act of our tragedy began when it became clear that they were going to take us out of Constantinople. But where? No one knew. Well, some were exiled to Ayash, others to Çankırı, these little places out of the limelight of the big city of Constantinople in the interior, and most were killed. A few were able to escape, including Father Balakian. Among those captured, of course, Gomidas, whose music we heard this evening. Siamanto, the poet, Daniel Varujan, perhaps the greatest poet of his generation, Adam Andonyan, and others. In a very moving and tragic scene during their imprisonment in the city of Çankırı in the interior of Turkey, Father Balakian describes a night when the prisoners all turned to prayer, led in chanting by Father Gomidas. He says, "I was able to secure a prayer book from the Armenian chapel, and on our 4th evening, with the permission of the captain, we began the Compline service, Vespers. We, the more than 150 intellectuals and comrades exiled from Constantinople, assembled, irrespective of political party or class, of piety or skepticism, to hold evening service at dusk. By dim candlelight, behind the high walls of the huge armory of Çankırı, with the icy spring gale blowing through the broken windows. When Gomidas Vartabed began his melancholy and heart-wrenching Der Volomya, Lord have mercy, the sobbing was impossible to contain. We all cried like boys, cried over loved ones left behind, cried over our black fate, our nation's misfortune. We cried over the bloody days we had just passed, even without knowing that we were on the brink of unprecedented storms of blood. Perhaps Gomidas Vartabed had never in his life sung Der Volomya with such emotion. Normally, he would sing it ex officio, out of duty, as solace for the pain, grief, and mourning of others. This time, he sang out of his own grief and emotional turmoil, asking the eternal God for comfort and solace. God, however, remained silent. Among those intellectuals imprisoned, exiled, and eventually killed was Krikor Zohrab, lawyer, parliamentarian, writer, and someone very relevant to my own life. About him, Father Balakian writes, the Ottoman parliament members Krikor Zohrab and Vartka Serengulian had been arrested in Constantinople during this time, and after being held in prison briefly, they had been put on a train to Diyarbakir on the pretext of being tried before the court-martial there. These two brave deputies, who had always struggled in the Ottoman parliament on behalf of Armenian interests, had the opportunity to meet with a few Armenians in Konya and refused the material help offered them. At the railway station of Eregli near Konya, an Armenian railroad official who belonged to the Dashnak party was brave enough to meet secretly with Zohrab and Vartkas and offer them help to escape. But they replied that being deputies of the Ottoman parliament, they were both elected officials in the Ottoman parliament, that they of course had no fear for their lives and no doubt that they would be acquitted by the court-martial in Diyarbakir. Krikor Zohrab was personal friends with Talat Pasha. Of course, he would be exonerated and let free. Finally, under mounted police soldiers' surveillance, Zohrab and Vartkas were put in a carriage and dispatched to Diyarbakir. When they reached a place called Karakopru, an hour from Urfa, Odessa, they were surrounded. The Circassians Mehmed and Khalil, with their armed and mounted chetis, these were essentially prisoners, armed brigands that the Turks would basically use to do the dirty work of slaughtering Armenians. Basically just they're prisoners, arm them, have at the Armenians, kill them, and whatever they have on them you can take. They halted the small caravan and ordered the police soldiers to leave the victims and return to Urfa as their job was done. Then the bandit chief took the doomed exiles from the carriages and nailed them to the ground with iron stakes that were 1 meter long. Then they beheaded them, stripped them naked, and cut off their limbs. Thus did Zohrab and Vartkas, the eloquent advocates of the Armenian people, having been elected to parliament during the Ottoman Representatives Assembly held following the adoption of the Ottoman Constitution of 1908, come to such criminal deaths. Much of the rest of the book is filled with similar and worse scenes of horrible torture and death that Father Balakian himself witnessed while disguising himself as a German soldier and trying to provide what spiritual and material help he could to the Armenian deportees along the death marches. Krikor Zohrab was survived by his wife Clara, his daughters Dolores and Hermine, and his sons Aram and Leon. His daughter Dolores left Constantinople for New York and married Henry Liebmann in 1932. Liebmann was a member and heir of a family that had made its fortune from their brewery business in Brooklyn. Mr. Liebmann died in 1950, leaving his estate to Dolores. Without any children, at the end of her life, 40 years later, she dedicated her estate to support both Jewish, in honor of her husband, Henry, and his family, and Armenian, in honor of herself and her parents, causes. That is, the two peoples who had suffered genocides in the 20th century and had found a new home in America. Among these philanthropic endeavors was a graduate student fellowship, which I myself received while a PhD student pursuing Armenian studies at UCLA. Among other major contributions to the Armenian church and community in America, she founded the Krikor and Clara Zohrab Information Center in her parents' names at the Diocese of the Armenian Church in New York City, where I'm the director of the Zohrab Center. And it was intended to be not just an information center connecting the Armenian community, this is before the internet age in the late 80s, but also crucially to be a center of culture, art, and learning for young Armenians in the US. In other words, Dolores used her wealth to foster Armenian culture and civilization not overseas, but in the new setting of America. Of course, she was not unique or alone in this endeavor. However, it bears emphasizing the importance of her vision of establishing endowments that would foster young people in this country to become custodians and creators of Armenian culture. Let's remember that at the beginning of Armenian immigration to the United States in the second half of the 19th century, before the genocide, most immigrants who came here did so as migrant workers who were sending money back home to the Ottoman Empire, many of them themselves planning to move back home to the Ottoman Empire after making enough money in America. The first church, a sign of putting down roots and becoming a permanent community, was not founded here until 1891, the Church of Our Savior in Worcester, Massachusetts. And it was only in the 1890s and first decades of the 1900s, with the increased oppression and violence against Armenians during the Hamidian massacres, that the mentality of immigrants started to shift, and they began to come to this country with the intent to stay and build a new life here. After the genocide, with destitute Armenian orphans in the Middle East, leading to the stereotype of starving Armenians abroad, this model of making money in America to send to Armenians overseas began to solidify. The primary role of Armenian Americans soon emerged to be one not of producing culture, but as philanthropists, funders, donors, or sponsors of Armenian communities overseas. This contrasts sharply, for example, with the Armenian communities of Lebanon, Beirut, Syria, Aleppo, where much more emphasis was placed on producing and fostering cultural producers, writers, teachers, newspaper editors, etc., who had mastery of the Armenian language and could produce new literary and cultural works. Vartan Abdo is a product of that community. Where Armenian culture was given attention in America, it was mostly in the form of past-looking preservation, whether in the form of museums or in preserving unchanged art forms from the past. We could mention, for example, the dance troupes in the Midwest, known for preserving the most unchanged the dances of pre-genocide Ottoman Armenians, or musicians like Richard Hagopian, Onik Dinkjian, and others who preserved unchanged Ottoman-era musical traditions and songs, etc. However, less attention has been paid to advancing culture or producing new cultural works. In other words, developing new producers of Armenian culture in the United States. That kind of work was seen, perhaps more subconsciously than consciously, to be the domain of Armenians from the Middle East and Armenia, especially after the fall of the Soviet Union. With the new Republic of Armenia and the unrecognized Republic of Nagorno-Karabakh in such need, the role of American Armenians, not as producers of culture, but as patrons and philanthropists, was solidified even more. When American Armenians decided to invest in cultural institutions on a large scale, they mostly chose to do so overseas, not as much in this country. Meanwhile, as the generations go on, American-born Armenians have become less and less connected with their own culture, which is seen more and more as a relic of the past with less connection to their contemporary lives. Unsurprisingly, very few American-born Armenians have grown up to be producers of culture themselves, because the schools and other cultural institutions in this country are less geared toward fostering cultural producers and rely more on importing them, foreign-born teachers or even priests who immigrate here. So let's ask ourselves, do we believe that Armenian culture can thrive here in the United States? Following the model of Nersa Shnorali, would it be possible to remake Armenian culture and civilization here on foreign soil? Can we build a new Cilicia, or many new Cilicias, in America? After Balakian's Golgotha, the crucifixion, can America be a site of resurrection for Armenian culture? These are more critical questions than ever for us to consider in the wake of the loss of Nagorno-Karabakh, the progressive depletion of the Armenian communities of the Middle East, due to wars and instability there, and the increasingly endangered state of the Republic of Armenia. I would like us to imagine a new model for Armenian community life in America for the remainder of the 21st century and beyond, focusing on civilizational investment and cultural production in this country, making one of the primary aims of our institutions and philanthropic work here to foster, nurture, and cultivate not just passive recipients of the past, but heirs, masters, and producers of Armenian culture here. Can the youth of this country not just aim to become successful, acquire wealth, and with some of their wealth support Armenian causes, but rather can they themselves become cultural leaders, producers of new culture in this country? I believe that the first generation of immigrants after the genocide who came to New York and eventually raised enough money to erect St. Vartan Cathedral in New York City had such a vision and inscribed precisely this message symbolically into the artistic decoration of the cathedral, specifically in its stained glass windows. If you've been to the cathedral, you've seen these on the wall opposite from the altar. On the left of the screen, you can see this is the full panel, and then it's broken up, or no, on the right of your screen. This is the full panel, and then broken up the top and the bottom. What is depicted here? This is from the Old Testament prophet Ezekiel, chapter 37, the Valley of Dry Bones. It's after the Babylonian conquest of Israel. Complete desolation. The prophet is led out into the desert and sees a valley of dry bones of those who've died in the previous generations. His people are gone from their land in exile. And he's given a vision by God of the bones coming back to life, muscles coming on them, being resurrected, essentially, and breath and spirit being put back into them. He famously asks, "Can these bones live?" And he sees them resurrected. Our ancestors who survived the genocide chose precisely this passage to apply to the experience of the Armenian genocide, the death in the desert of Deir Zor, Syria, and being resurrected, but where? In the panel beside, we see where. This is the St. Vartan from the 5th century. And above, what's happening? More detailed in this panel. You see the ladders and the construction. It's the construction of a church. And it's not just any church, it's the cathedral itself that you're standing in. And right below it, Ait Pen Kim, the first 3 letters of the Armenian alphabet, meant to symbolize essentially the center and home of Armenian culture, which has been the church, and the prime medium or vehicle of Armenian culture, which is the language, that they are re-erecting and resurrecting here in America, here in New York. As a concluding illustration to help us imagine what could be possible in regard to creating new culture in this country, I would like to use the example of my late sister, Tenny Arlen, who tragically died in a car accident in 2015. Like me, she did not speak Armenian growing up, but learned the language as an undergraduate student at UCLA, where our modern Armenian language teacher, Hagop Galugian, emphasized acquiring the language in order to produce new writing in Armenian. Tenny wrote a series of poems, mostly while an undergraduate student at UCLA from 2011 to 2013, that she was planning to publish as a book before her early death at the age of 24. That book was published posthumously in Armenia in 2021 with the title Girko Vasalu Inchu Hosam, to say with passion, "Why am I here?" a line from one of her poems that I'll read. Notably, her book was the first full-length book of creative literature, fiction or poetry, by an American-born writer to be published in the Armenian language. Imagine, during the over 150 years of Armenian community life in America, not one American-born writer had published a full-length book of creative prose or poetry in the Armenian language before her. Later this year, we're going to release a bilingual edition, which will have the poems, the Armenian original and English side by side. But as a way of closing, and as a way to witness the beauty and potential of new Armenian culture in the New World, I would like to read a few of her poems. In this first one, which is a prose poem based on the title of an essay by Daniel Varoujan, one of the poets arrested and killed in 1915, Tenny reflects on the history and contemporary significance of the Armenian language, how here in the diaspora the language has been severely reduced in many settings to usage that many have called kitchen Armenian, using Armenian to talk just about food, domestic life, mundane, everyday things, or things of the past, but not as a vehicle of reflection on the meaning of life, existence, or the most important questions one faces, or the creation of beauty, which is something Tenny herself does in Armenian throughout her book. First, I'll read this one in Armenian and then in English. Հայ լեզվի խնդիրը. Հայ լեզուն դարիներով կվերապրեր, իր քոյությունը կվտանգվեր, իր դունը կխորդակվեր, բայց կաբրեր. Հայ լեզուն մոլորական հովուն պես կջամփորդեր լերներուն միջև, քդերուն քով, ծովերուն վրա. Անհիմա կաբրի դարբեր վանքերու մեջ, քաղաքի մեջ, գյուղի մեջ, ակարագի մեջ, բայց ինչի համար, ըսալու դուն, ջաշ, մայր, հայր, խոհանոց, թե ըսալու փնություն, մայրը, որ ինձի կյանք տվավ, գիրքով ըսալու ինչու հոսեմ. The question of the Armenian language. The Armenian language survived for many years. Its existence was threatened. Its home was shattered, but it lived. The Armenian language, like the erratic wind, traveled through mountains, by rivers, on oceans. Now it lives in different monasteries, in the city, in the village, on the farm. But for what? To say house, meal, mother, father, kitchen, or to say nature, the mother who gave me life, to say with passion, why am I here? In this next poem, Tenny reflects on silence and speech, the critical role of poets and storytellers to give meaning to our lives, to create new life after great loss, all themes connected with our topic tonight and relevant for any people who have suffered genocide or great loss. I'm going to read just the English translation, but the Armenian original's on the screen. The narration. Moments strike with force, moments, and their fleeting happiness, pain, their impermanent joy, solitude. After the fall, it is the silence that tries to repress. After the fall, there is the moment without sound. We die through silence. Like dust that falls to the windowsill and slowly settles, the dust, in stillness and time, buries the moments, buries the history. The obliteration of words, the meaninglessness of life. The world breaks to pieces. When suddenly, by speaking, the birth of words, the rebirth of the world. The word, the breath from the mouth, stirs the dust and uncovers the windowsill. The silenced narrative has been told. We live by those who tell, who give a voice, who give breath in the immense silence. And now, in this final poem that I'll read, Tenny reflects with wonder on beauty itself. Only a culture that is alive creates. By implication, one of the chief signs that a culture is dead is that it can no longer create new works of beauty. As I read this final poem, let's ponder as an Armenian American community whether we can build little Cilicias here in America, whether we can create new works of beauty in this country. Beauty. How is it you exist? We call you many names, building tall towers, constructing crystal castles, publishing periodicals, binding books and books of you. Here you are. No, there. You are what I say you are. Bacteria, squirming, lifeless, beneath microscope's eye, picked at, spot after spot. But you speak. Apricot sunset, trembling leaf, a blush from petals, pregnant terror in storms, silver lake of moon, and I wonder at the magnitude, clinging to existence. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Arlen. You know, Jesse came so highly regarded, and it's evident as to why. And I really encourage everyone here, if you haven't already, to please find an opportunity to read some of his work, because the elegance of his writing and the breadth of his knowledge is just staggering. So thank you so much for being here this tonight. And we will have a little additional of Jesse, because he will be reading our concluding prayer for us this evening as well. He's stepping in and helping us in all sorts of ways tonight. Traditionally, at this point, our concluding remarks would be shared by Marjorie Feinstein. Marjorie is the founding chair of the Communications Department here at St. Elizabeth University, and she is also the chair of the Holocaust and Genocide Center's Advisory Board. Unfortunately, she's not here. She's actually off in Europe, continuing her work to fight anti-Semitism, but she wanted me to share her words with you this evening. But before I do ask that if you have a moment, that you please take a quick glance at the back of the program tonight, because what you will see is an extensive thank you list. And I would be completely remiss if I did not mention all of the people, or list there all of the people who are necessary and so vital to putting together a program like this evening, including members of our advisory board, a couple of whom are here tonight, Reverend Jeff Marquet and both Ray and Yolanda Kunz, who are here, and their devotion to the center is matched only by their love of the university. And I thank them so much for being here. And I also want to recognize one of my just limitlessly talented colleagues, Dr. Ann Langen. Dr. Langen she's the chair of the sociology department. And it should be noted, Dr. Langen was not only a former director of our center, but she's also an incredibly skilled professor and continuing student in the field of Holocaust and genocide studies, focusing on what we need more than anything else, which is prevention. So thank you all for being here tonight. With that, I will share Marjorie's words with you. I probably should have had Vartan do this, but I will do my best. Marjorie says this to all of us tonight. Thank you all for enabling us to be part of what has become sacred space for over 35 years of our Center for Holocaust and Genocide Education's extraordinary existence. While our esteemed speakers have been thanked accordingly, I do want to add my own personal warm extension of regard to Roy Stepanian, who was the proverbial wind beneath our wings tonight, bringing this Armenian genocide commemoration to the beautiful St. Elizabeth University. Incidents of anti-Semitism and hate speech on campuses and in our communities throughout the nation is at an all-time high. The proverbial words of never again have resonated to become now. Bringing this concern closer to home, the simple truth is that students often lack the understanding about responding to alarming acts of hatred of any kind. We are hoping to share in our all being here together in this effort, as it becomes clear that in order to inform the present, we need to pass on the lessons of the past, to ensure that as we move further away from the events like the Armenian Genocide, the Holocaust, and recently known to us all too many war crimes and genocides, we must continue to take our personal leads in creating more learning opportunities to preserve humankind. But, as I often remind others, guess what? That's not even close to being enough. If we fear, and maybe in our worst moments we do believe that our world is descending into darkness, then it becomes up to each and every one of us, and especially the younger generation, most of whom are students, to summon up the belief from somewhere in our souls that we have the power to push back all of the bad and towards the light. So how do we do that? Well, I remind all of you that you have a very special mission when you leave our campus tonight, that you are now charged with passing on the lessons we have learned. We need to empower ourselves and our students to stand up and respond to acts of hate and prejudice. We can share in being able to provide the voices for those who cannot speak. We urge you to think forward about what you can do by saying, "Here I am." The survival of memory lies in our hands. For as listeners and as witnesses this evening, we can all become living legacies, enabling ourselves and especially our young to truly represent hope for the future. I encourage all of you to be part of our St. Elizabeth University Center for Holocaust and Genocide Education programming all year long, not just this evening. We especially look forward to welcoming you back to our campus at our annual Holocaust Remembrance Kristallnacht commemoration in the fall. Please know how much we value your support, your attendance, and your connections to our center. And everything that Marjorie said, I absolutely support and double that emotion. Thank you so much for being here. And with that, I would like to again welcome to our stage Dr. Jesse Arlen with our concluding prayer. Thank you.
If you would, please stand with me while we pray. Hanun horia vortvoya vokvin serpo. Christ our God, you crown your saints with triumph, and you do the will of all who fear you, looking after your creatures with love and kindness. Hear us from your holy and heavenly realm by the intercession of the Holy Mother of God and by the prayers of all your saints, especially the holy martyrs who gave their lives during the Armenian Genocide for faith and for the homeland, whom we commemorate today. Hear us, Lord, and show us your mercy. Forgive, redeem, and pardon our sins. Make us worthy, thankfully, to glorify you with the Father and with the Holy Spirit, now and always, and unto the ages of ages. Amen.
Once again, on behalf of the entire community of St. Elizabeth University, I thank you all for your attendance tonight. Thank you, in particular, to Dr. Jesse Arlen for his brilliance. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Have a wonderful evening. We appreciate it. Have a great night.